It's great to see a full house. It's nice as well to see some familiar faces as well. Sorry, I'm going to have some papers and my phone for notes. I'm Saima, as Lily introduced me. Just another point of housekeeping. I know everyone's very busy and we need to take calls, but out of respect for our contributors tonight, if you could put your phones on silent, try not to throw your drinks around, and enjoy your drinks, of course. I actually spilt mine in the middle of a BAFTA screening a couple of weeks ago. It's really embarrassing. And yeah, just keep your phones on silent, please. If you have to take a call, just, leave the room. Try not to text. We can see you doing it. Right, I'm Saima Mohsin. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight with John Lee and Tamana Ayazi. I've got their bios to go through with you. And, these are two people who have done some incredible work in Afghanistan and around the world. And so it's important to tell you a bit about them. I'm sure you know about them as well yourselves. So John Lee Anderson has documented Afghanistan's recent history like few others, from the late 1980s, the Mujahideen resistance to the post 9/11 intervention, and of course the Taliban's return in 2021. His new book, which was just mentioned, To Lose a War, brings together almost 25 years of that reporting, combining his earlier dispatches with new material to present a clear chronological account of how the conflict unfolded and why it ended in collapse. He's been a staff writer, of course, at The New Yorker since 1998. He's reported on conflict zones around the world, including Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Angola, Somalia, Lebanon, and also produced extensive work from Latin America. And he has just returned from Colombia, Cuba, via Washington. So there is much to discuss with John Lee. Tamana Ayazi, of course, is an Emmy-winning Afghan filmmaker. She's a journalist, a National Geographic explorer, and she was born and raised in Afghanistan. She left in 2021. Her work focuses on women's rights, political upheaval, the lived realities of communities navigating conflict and repression. Her debut feature documentary, In Her Hands, premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival, won numerous awards and accolades. She's also known for her earlier work on the Academy Award-winning short documentary, Learning to Skateboard in a War Zone, brackets, If You're a Girl, where the light shines, and One Bullet, most recently in 2023. Thank you both for being here with me tonight. It's a real pleasure. I'm going to wind back a bit and start with you, Tamana, about let's go back to 2001, and those early expectations when we knew that the US an invasion was happening. The Taliban was going to, we thought, be forced out. What were your expectations of what might come in Afghanistan for the Afghan people?
Hi everyone, and thank you so much, Saima, for the intro. When Taliban, in 2001, when we got rid of the Taliban for the first time, it felt like a fresh breeze of air, to be honest. I was a kid. I used to go to underground schools. There was a lot of uncertainty, but also you could see freedoms. For example, we were allowed to watch TV again without worrying about neighbors reporting us. My father got, they trimmed their beard and stuff like that. We saw a lot of change. I went to a real school for the first time. But also, everything was not rosy. There was a lot of uncertainty going on because we didn't feel connected with what was happening. We were happy that Taliban were not there anymore, but as a child also, and seeing your family, your parents, when you live in a place like Afghanistan, when there is conflict and repression, you see the changes happening. It's part of your daily life. But it it came with a lot of uncertainty as well.
A lot of trepidation for you. And I guess that's because there was a force that was the Taliban, and then a new force that was just as alien to the people. John, as a journalist going in there, what was your viewpoint of what you thought might happen?
Yeah, I think what happened on 9/11 was so apocalyptic in so many ways. It was such a kind of global. It had such a global impact, you know. I think there was a lot of shock, and initially, I think most Americans thought, and journalists included, thought it would be a police action, unlike anything we'd seen before, but nonetheless a kind of a police action to punish the regime that had given the Al-Qaeda sanctuary, and, you know, something fairly quick. And of course, that's not what happened. Very quickly, and I kind of went in through the north along with other journalists came in as the war was beginning. I came in from the north, from Tajikistan, and followed the falling cities to Kabul and then eventually Kandahar, where I had spent time 12 years before at the end of the anti-Soviet jihad, you know. So for me, it was some new ground and some familiar territory. But very soon, the whole enterprise, American-led enterprise, seemed to go into a kind of disarray as you had Kabul began to fill up with, you know, Westerners representing all kinds of interests, women's rights, you know, AID, CIA, military, and there were special forces sort of rampaging around in the hinterland. They had failed to apprehend bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and so there was a kind of wrong-footedness about the enterprise as it got underway. By 2002, there was a sense of something happening in the capital and other things going on in the hinterland. There was a sense that the Taliban had not been defeated so much as had disappeared. And that was definitely the case in a number of places. When I returned to Kandahar, where I'd spent time 12 years before, the mullah who had been my host, the Mujahideen leader who had been my host, was supposed to have handed over the leader of the Taliban to the Americans and their appointed Viceroy Karzai a few weeks before. And instead, he had let them escape. So when I revisited him, he was under a kind of a dark cloud. And it was the beginning of this time in which you were aware that there were shifting alliances throughout the country. Mullah Naqib, my former host, was under a cloud from the new leaders, the new authorities in, say, the south of Afghanistan. But the Taliban were just there, sort of somewhere in the shadows. And that's the way it remained as more and more thousands of Americans and Westerners poured in, and until they began to reinsert themselves about 3 or 4 years later in different parts of the country.
And it's interesting that you talk about how quickly the landscape changed from 2001 to 2002. So there were all misjudgments, as we have seen before in Afghanistan for centuries. And there were strategic shifts that shaped the war as well along the way.
Yes, there was. Well, I think, you know, keep in mind this was after all the George W. Bush administration, and 9/11 happened just, was it 9 months into his presidency? And so we saw this response in Afghanistan. Initially, the world, so to speak, was with the United States in this effort to apprehend the people who'd committed this act of terrorism. But the US being the US and the West being the West, sort of everybody else poured in as well. I remember a friend in New York, a woman I knew who having, you know, everybody was suddenly learning about Afghanistan, rediscovering it, or discovering it for the first time. She represented a private school in New York, and they wanted to desperately help girls a girls' school in Afghanistan. There was even a group of clowns from Italy who wanted to make, the Afghan kids smile again. And then there was, any number of NGOs, carpetbaggers, entrepreneurs, just every kind of character and interest group you can imagine poured into this new crucible of American interest. And before you knew it, billions of dollars were being apportioned here and there. An anecdote to give you an idea. A month after the fall of Kabul, the young guy I'd come down with from the Tajik border, who by then, he had gone from being a wannabe migrant. He was going to smuggle himself to London, and at the time the war began, was considering whether or not to smuggle 2 kilos of heroin to reduce the cost of getting to London, to the Russian border guards who were controlling the flights from Dushanbe to Moscow, to suddenly realizing that he could play the market as the CIA brought money into the country to the warlords. By the time Kabul fell, he was worth maybe $50,000 and owned 2 Russian Jeeps, which he was renting out to people like me and drivers. It was not long before he was quite wealthy and even being considered as a government minister. It took a couple of years. A real character. But at any rate, we were in Kabul, the new Kabul. Taliban were nowhere to be seen. But the women were still wearing burqas. Everything was still very tense. And one day, we hadn't been there long, a sort of Toyota Land Cruiser convoy pushed through the crowd. And he said, "Oh, that's my friend, Hassan." He talked about him with great admiration. This was a guy who was in his late 20s. My friend was maybe 21. And I said, "Oh," he said, "He's very rich. He's like this with the special forces. He's a millionaire." I said, "How did he become a millionaire?" He said, "The special forces wanted a compound. They offered him, they liked his cousin's mud fortress. He told his, relatives to move out for a few dollars, and they gave him $50,000 to make this their base. Or maybe it was $150,000. And they liked it so much they said, "Get us 10 of these around the country," which he did. And by the time I met him, he was now a millionaire and something of a warlord himself. And this began to happen within weeks of the Americans' arrival. Newly empowered entrepreneurs, some of them with goodness in their hearts, and others with profit in their minds. And it kind of went on from there. And that was I'm just talking about the very early days. It was a place where, I don't know, I suppose Silver City, Nevada, 1865 would have been maybe an analogous place. Money could be made, fortunes could be made, futures could be made. And for a while, the people that had been controlling the place were nowhere to be seen, unless you were out in the villages. And pretty soon they would be coming around, warning you that you had to also pay attention to the fact that they would one day come back into power, and that was the Taliban.
Tamana, on the other side of the spectrum, a young woman growing up in Afghanistan, what were you witnessing? What was your experience of all of this? And if I can add a third question in all of this, what drove you to becoming a journalist to document this?
So I was really young. I managed to start from 2nd grade, not first, because I used to go to underground schools, and I passed all those tests. But from what I remember, one of my cousins came to ours and said there is aid coming because people were really poor. So that's what I remember. I'm from the north, from Mazar. So my neighbors, all of them went to get some food. And also, I remember going to school because we were so disconnected with the outside world. We didn't even know who were the guys with guns outside. And now I know the international community and the allies. when I went to school, the books, notebooks, and pens were distributed by UNICEF, which was positive. I was super excited. I could hear hundreds of girls smiling, you know, having the time, the space to be together to get an education without fear of being arrested, tortured, or humiliated in public places, because we had to cover our books under our clothes when I used to go to underground schools. What made me, and also I need to add that how I see it, a lot of money came to Afghanistan, but unfortunately it was distributed between max 200 families, and they were warlords. They were not people with good intention, and we need to understand this, because if we don't understand this, we might repeat the same mistakes in Afghanistan or elsewhere. What made me become a filmmaker and a journalist, when I was 16 years old, there was a program by the US Embassy. Good things also happened during that time. And I joined a 6-month citizen journalism and documentary filmmaking program, and I was representing my hometown. The intention was because I'm very introverted. I like my thoughts, I like writing, I like observing people, I like telling stories. And that was a way of, you know, expressing myself and also documenting what was happening around me, especially focused on women and girls.
What did you learn through your body of work, through your experiences in that time?
I think it's not easy. What we do is not easy, but there is so much kindness and care in what we do, and that's the reason we all are sitting here today. I learned to resist in different ways. I learned to find hope in the middle of the crisis, because as soon as you lose hope, that's the end. In my culture, it's so important to have that in you, no matter what happens. And maybe that's what keeps all of us moving, all these Afghans, after all these years.
Thank you. It's quite a juxtaposition, isn't it, when we're discussing the real life situation of Afghans and Afghan women and communities like yours, and then the other extreme end of what's happening in Kabul, when you're creating this kind of imposed elite of Afghans where money's being chucked at people that aren't necessarily have the right intentions. It's just so messy. And then there's the military operation that's going on as well, and their lack of grasp of what to do or where they were headed with the military operation in Afghanistan. There's so many things to discuss. I want to bring in the military and what was going on the ground with that, because I remember I moved to Pakistan in 2007 to launch their first English news channel, and would regularly interview various ISAF commanders. And I remember one night asking one of them on air, you know, has the Taliban and the territory got the better of ISAF? And he was so stumped, he didn't know how to answer it. And that kind of feels like it encapsulates, John, what was going on, really. They went in, they chucked a lot of money at the situation. You thought there was going to be a kind of police operation, but it ended up being 20 years long.
Yeah. I mean, keep in mind that within a year and a half of the intervention in Afghanistan, the U.S. was invading Iraq. And that was fundamental to, I think, what happened ultimately in Afghanistan. You know, there was this kind of, as I said before, this kind of, a lot of it was positive, you know, the kind of discovery of Afghanistan. There was a kind of love affair even with Afghanistan. You might remember as a young girl, the Karzai, you know, the titular president, sort of plucked out of obscurity, and everybody loved him for the clothes he wore. You know, there were, the Washington Post style section did an entire column just about how you know, chic he was with his shaban, which once he realized that, he wore it everywhere. And of course, at one point, he was sort of the Zelensky of his day until Trump, did what he did with Zelensky in the Oval Office. Zelensky could do no wrong in the world, right? Well, it was the same with Karzai for the first couple of years. Everybody loved him. And he was the guy who represented, the best of Afghanistan, and we were going to make this country, it was going to prevail over this obscurantism which had kept it in tyranny and repression. And so, again, women's rights issues, well diggers, entrepreneurs, all kinds of people were there fanning out, and the Taliban weren't anywhere to be seen. And then March, actually by the end of 2002, the war drums began beating on Iraq. America invaded Iraq. Of course, things continued in Afghanistan, but for about 3 years, and of course that war went terribly sour very fast. By 2005, I also was diverted from Afghanistan. In 2002, I came back in 2005 as a breather. I came back to Afghanistan and to do a profile of Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, who by now struck me as he was a puppet, but somehow a likable puppet. I wanted to explore how much power he actually held now 4 years or 3.5 years into the American occupation. And so I spent quite a bit of time around him with the Americans and also with Afghans and how they viewed him. And I realized that by now, he was seen as a figurehead. He was not invested with real muscular sovereign power. And I began to have conversations with him, with the American ambassador, and with others about this lack of power, the lack of visible sovereign power he held as Afghanistan's president. And I could feel the trouble beginning. I followed up. I was in a number of what they call, Diwan's audiences, where he received petitioners from the provinces, and he made promises to them, and then was not able to follow up because he depended on the Americans to do so. And they didn't follow up for him. So I began to become critical, and it shows in some of my reporting from the time, of the way the Americans were handling this. It was my sense that he needed to be, whoever was in charge of Afghanistan needed to be Afghan, visibly Afghan for the Afghan people. Right around that same time, the Taliban began to resurge in the provinces. The Americans and their allies, maybe because of Iraq, were late in providing visible change of basic infrastructure in the country. It's one thing to go to a village and talk about women's rights or to dig a well. These are kind of invisible things, and they rattled the old guard, the old imams and others in these villages. But they didn't, they didn't build playgrounds. They didn't build things. They didn't show that the West was here. They didn't do good counterinsurgency, if you asked me. And they completed the ring road of Afghanistan, which had been there before and long since fallen into dirt and mud. And for I don't know how many billions of dollars given to some American contracting company that took 2 or 3 years to build, maybe $5 or $10 billion they paid them. So they made a lot, some company made a lot of money. It was not Afghan. And by the time they finished paving this, the Taliban were on the road decapitating the engineers working on it. And that was 2005. For me, that was a marker. From that point on, the Taliban began to resurface, and it was clear within a couple years more that they were coming back pretty much all over the country.
But what about the way the military and the allies conducted themselves as well? Because the fighting was a two-way street, right? And there was a lot of talk about hearts and minds, but there were also bombings and fighting on the ground. And
yeah. So in the beginning, it was this kind of police action. They were chasing Al Qaeda groups here and there, and yes, they would rile up sort of allies, tacit Taliban allies in certain remote areas because they would do rough operations. They would do night raids. They would kick down doors. They would humiliate husbands and fathers in front of their women and children. This is, an act of that you can't get around if you're an Afghan man. You're required to fight if that happens to you by, through all of their customs. The Americans did not understand this. And as they began to get bogged down in the mid-2000s, as the Taliban resurged, it became a NATO operation. And so you had multiple nationalities coming from all kinds of countries. In some cases, they were apportioned certain provinces, and they would rotate after a year. So the Japanese would be here, and then they would be replaced by, I don't know, the Canadians or something. So there was not a kind of institutional evolution. There was not an evolutionary process through which the people making war learned and built on the past experience. There was this kind of rotation. You had changing presidencies in the United States. There was this effort to surge under Obama, where they threw in another 30,000 troops, I think it was. And by now, the Taliban knew that the West was floundering there and were able to come back in. By now, the raids that the Americans and their allies were conducting in different areas involved killing people, involved raids, bombing missions where sometimes they didn't kill the right people. They would massacre a wedding party, that kind of thing. And in a lot of the remote parts of Afghanistan, the body of opinion shifted, especially in the Pashtun areas where the Taliban are strong, to the Taliban. The Taliban, as I said before, were never really defeated. They melted away, as guerrillas do. You hide so you don't get killed, and then you come back. You let people know that you're there, and you take action against them if they're seen to be siding with the enemy. The West never had true dominion intelligence, what I would call intelligence dominion. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Just two quick anecdotes on that to kind of, one. In 2010.
I gave him the eye.
In 2010, I got the eye. In 2010, I asked a young American captain, well-intended, West Point educated, was it true, as I'd heard, that there was no requirement to speak either Dari or Pashto, the two main languages in Afghanistan? He said, that's true, although recently they've asked us to learn 60 words. This was 2010. That was 9 years into it. By then it was lost. So that's all I have to say on that, since you gave me the eye.
Yeah, no. And as a journalist, and you see soldiers taking out candies to give to kids, and they think that will, win the war. And as you say, there were massacres. There was Abu Ghraib. There was,
That was Iraq.
Sorry, yes,
But yeah.
Exactly. I just realised.
That was the equivalent.
Exactly. There were drone attacks you mentioned the surge in Obama, drone attacks went up, all of those scenarios. And Tamana, as a young woman who's now grown up, become politically aware, understanding what's going on, you said, earlier you benefited from one of the programs that was trying to win hearts and minds. What did you think was happening in terms of the military side of the war?
I appreciate the freedoms that we had. I appreciate the chance to get an education. I appreciate those friendships I made during that time. I also appreciate that so many women could go and be, on TV. We Afghans, we love storytelling. We love poetry. We love music. We love jokes. We are loud. Even in the villages, wherever you go, even if there is not enough light, we just, there is a candle, we sit together and talk about things. And I also want to add that we Afghans are very politically aware because, when things happen in your life early on, you observe things and you get it, because even if you don't talk about it, your parents do. And that's how you learn so much about your surroundings. A lot of mistakes happened during the time. A lot of war crime happened. And many Taliban and their leaders were killed in 2001. And some of the Taliban approached the US and they wanted amnesty to come back and be able to live in their villages, in their cities. But because that was ignored and international allies attacked and raided all those houses in the villages just because of how people were clothing and how the haircut they had, it was similar to Taliban. But in those villages, that's how they are. And it created a lot of trauma. International community and Afghans never felt connected to each other, because now that I live here, now that I'm here, I understand it even more, how we all are different, even if we are wearing the same clothes, because our experiences are different. What we went through is different, so it's good to just sit and listen to people themselves before deciding for them. And that happened in Afghanistan when it came to freedom, when it came to democracy, when it came to feminism, when it came to like everything, personally and politically and socially, and even economically. Yeah, that's how I see it. I think a lot of mistakes happened. We had a great opportunity to make that place a safe and secure place for Afghans, all of them, not just women and girls. But unfortunately, I don't want to say we failed, because if I say we failed, it means that a generation like me and people before and after me, we had that opportunity. We are risking that, we are ignoring that courage. We are ignoring that generation because I'm one of them.
Well, you might say the Afghan people didn't fail, but the US invasion failed.
The warlords failed as well, because they had their bad intentions. They had an opportunity. That's why I don't want to, I always say that it's not black and white. That's why we need to communicate. We need to talk. And we need to listen carefully and actively. Otherwise, we will come up with our own perspectives. And that's not how it should be when a country is involved. The US failed in Afghanistan. International community failed in Afghanistan because of, the time and opportunity and all that money that went to Afghanistan, and we couldn't use it in the right way. I'm not saying that Afghan people failed, because we resisted. We are still resisting. Even if it's underground schools, we are there. I talk to people on a daily basis, because I have family, I have friends, I have relatives back home, and the way I see that teenagers, they go to the basement and just do yoga, meditation, or they stretch. And that's resistance. It doesn't have to be on the streets all the time. It doesn't have to involve lots of killing. There are, underground schools organized by my own friends in my hometown and so many other places, in the villages, in the cities. But it's resistance. The cost for resistance in Afghanistan is very, very high, because you can face a lot of consequences, including arrest, torture. But I'm proud of what they are doing. They're really brave and courageous. I don't want to say that Afghans or Afghan people are, passive victims. We are survivors.
Absolutely. And that's why I wanted to differentiate between the Afghan people and the invading forces and their misjudgments, as well-intentioned as they might have been at the beginning or not, depending on your perspective. Where do you see Afghanistan moving post yet another disastrous withdrawal from the US?
I think it's very difficult, because when I left, I thought it was for a week or 2 weeks or max 6 months. That was what I was talking with my colleagues, and they said, okay, yeah, 6 months. It's so difficult to predict it, but I'm saying that it's not impossible because all these powers came to Afghanistan. Systems change, politics change, policies change. All we have to do is stay connected outside and inside Afghanistan. I'm not pro-war. I hate war because that's the reason I lost so much. But yeah, by staying connected, even supporting all those girls who are teaching underground schools, if we have a talent, a skill, we can support them even through that. I think we should do that now because it's so empowering to see them do what they do in a situation like that. Today, when I wanted to come here, I had options to wear this, or something else, but they don't have that option. They don't have the option to choose what they wear, where they go, how they go, but I do. And that's privilege, and we all have privilege in this room and outside this room. But people back home, they don't have that.
So you're saying that there are still ways we can support the people of Afghanistan, and that's why this discussion is so important tonight, because as there are more and more conflicts around the world, which I know you're both keen to discuss tonight, we mustn't forget Afghanistan.
Exactly, and also I do have my days. I'm like, okay, nothing will change, but I do have hope deep down, in my heart. I know that something is going to happen. Yeah, I have seen so much. I'm not that old, but sometimes I feel older than my own age because of the experiences. I also know that, as I mentioned before, without hope we can't continue. We need to continue. And this is the time to continue, because if everything is rosy and perfect, we don't need that, but now we need it.
I think I'm conscious of the time, but I know you're both keen to discuss a couple more things that I'm going to squeeze in. I think it's important to discuss Afghanistan in a wider global context, Western imperialism, or as some people see it, attempted colonization. How do the different crises we're witnessing around the world right now connect? Can we draw parallels? Are there parallels? Cautious ones? John?
Yeah, first of all, I'd say, obviously, Afghanistan endures, it continues. It's got an incredibly resilient and tough society. They've been undergoing, invasions for centuries. The American one, as surreal as it turned out to be, was merely the latest in a series of foreign expeditions to Afghanistan. And it ended the way it ended. Now, the fact that it ended when it did in 2021 sort of set the tone, I think, in my view, for a lot of things that have happened since. Keep in mind that the Taliban walked back into Kabul at the end of August 2021. It was only 6 months later that Putin decided he would, after all, invade Ukraine. And I think the calculation by Putin was that he could get away with it. He could do that now because Biden, the then American president, appeared to be at least reading the situation wrongly. You could say a lot about Biden, but that he misread the situation in Afghanistan and what it meant geostrategically. In a way, it was analogous to the end of the American intervention in Vietnam 50 years earlier. In the immediate aftermath of that debacle, when the Americans left Saigon, in a similar fashion, we've all seen the pictures of the people leaving from the embassy roof on a helicopter. The Soviets pressed their advantage around the world in about a half a dozen places. In the immediate aftermath, on the calculation that America had arguably been defeated, was on the back foot on the global chessboard. It had a new outsider, weak American president in those days, Jimmy Carter, and it could go for it. Ironically, one of the last things it did in that 4-year period was the invasion of Afghanistan, which turned out to be the wrong thing for the Soviets eventually. So it's funny how history shoehorns, dovetails, and it's done so a number of times in Afghanistan. So I think it's very likely that Putin might have made a move on Ukraine. I mean, of course, he had been intervening since 2014, but on the scale he did in 2022 may not have happened if it hadn't been for the American retreat from Afghanistan. And so we now have Trump again, and he in turn seems to be a figure who we've all noticed is enthralled to Putin, seems to want to mimic his behavior. And just as Putin has thrown caution to the winds and restored a kind of, I will invade who I want now, so is he. And we've seen that just in the last few weeks when he has decided to make America, North America, United States, the maximum hegemon of the Western Hemisphere, but also possibly intervene in Iran, possibly go here, possibly go there, possibly seize Greenland. So I think we see, we tend, I think, to dress up the motivations or stratagems of our leaders. But with Trump, I don't think you have to go too far.
So lessons haven't been learnt. I mean, you've just returned from Colombia and then
Cuba,
via Washington. Lessons have not been learnt.
Well, again, it depends on how you view those lessons. If you're Trump and you don't care about rule of law, democracy, human rights, or any of those things, which obviously he doesn't, you're looking at Putin and saying he's getting away with that. He's got all that territory. They really belong to him. These really belong to me. That's the lessons he's drawing. And he's seeing a vacuum of authority whereby he can operate in amongst weaker nations. He can he can make America great again by bullying poorer or weaker nations in our backyard and across the puddle over here in Europe. Because they're being scared by Putin, he can also make them feel a little more fragile and therefore get something out of it.
But no invasion, he just goes in and snatches a president.
That was pretty clever, I have to say. I'm not. It's one of the few operations where I say that so far, it looks more sophisticated than I initially thought. Because imagine, you invade a country, you launch a raid, you kill people, you snatch the president and his wife, but you don't leave any troops on the ground so that his colleagues or comrades can shoot at you. So there's no civil war situation. There's no force to fight against. There's no foreign invader to fight against. It's fait accompli. And a few hours after the raid, you hold a press conference and you say, you owe us $50 billion in oil. You now have to work for us. You must submit your budget every month to us, and we will decide if we approve it. If you don't do that, we will hit you hard again. That's the situation Venezuelans are under right now. And so far, they're singing to his tune. This is not edifying behavior, but in terms of sheer power, a sheer power play, it's fairly impressive. It may not work out, and it's very crass, but then Trump is crass.
And a lot less, it has to be said, a lot less people killed than we've seen, unfortunately, in Afghanistan, whether that's the NATO troops or Afghan people.
So do you recommend this as a model for the future?
We don't have time to have this discussion maybe another time, but the irony is ultimately bin Laden was also found by, US troops going in, snatching him from his home in
Pakistan's West Point.
In Abbottabad. I was there at the house. Not
at
inside, obviously.
Afterwards,
in the immediate aftermath. Not having a cup of tea. Tamana, just anxious. I'm conscious of the time. Don't worry, everyone. But I know you have questions to ask as well. But one thing I know that Pranvera and you are keen to discuss, and obviously because we talk a lot about the situation for women in Afghanistan. Often we talk about places like Afghanistan or Iran as though some faraway troubled place with an authoritarian regime, absolutely hideous, no democracy, how women are being treated over there. And we forget, we take a moral high ground and we forget what's happening in our own backyard. And I think with the Epstein files and the fallout of all of that, we have to actually take a look at ourselves as well and how women and young girls are being treated in the West, which we hold to such high regard.
For me, as a woman and also as a woman from Afghanistan, it doesn't matter where you are from, where you are, west or east, north or south. Violence is violence, rape is rape, extremism is extremism, and we need to reflect a little more. We need to observe our actions and behaviors, and also we need to learn from mistakes. If we don't do that, this will continue the way, it is happening, or it happened in the past.
Thank you. I am going to hand it over to the floor now. I think there are some mics. So if we're going to take 2 questions at a time, if you want to put your hands up with any questions, I will endeavour to see you and point to you. There's okay, you're handing the mics out.
Hi.
Lady in white, I think. If you want to say your name, you can. Where you're from, you can. And then pose your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lile Rutai. I'm a Hungarian journalist freelance. And as a preface, not to place any blame on you or responsibilities or whatsoever, I was just wondering, knowing what the situation on the ground is like in Afghanistan now, what the women's rights issues are like, what's the life that women lead, and in general the population, is there anything that you would have done different in your reporting? Or to switch the question, is there something that you're proud of on how you reported?
No, that's a great question. We'll take one more. There was a gentleman with a beard with his hand up, I think. Yeah, and then afterwards there's a gentleman behind you, I just saw. Thank you.
Hi, my name's David. I'm from the UK. A question for either of you. Is there anything that you would comment on in general, how the occupation in general was reported in the West? We had examples of atrocities, but what were the details, were the nuance of the situation actually accurately captured for us?
Thank you. 2 great questions. I think you can both answer them. Who wants to go first?
Sorry,
so
that's
it was.
me.
Would you, looking back,
Uh-huh.
would you have reported differently on what you reported on? And is that the gist of what you asked? Yeah.
I think as a journalist in that situation, even during Republic, it was not as easy. To be a journalist, to be young, to be a woman, to go to the mountains, all those provinces, because most of those places were divided between Afghan government, the militia, and Taliban themselves. So it was super tricky. I think as a filmmaker and journalist, I did my best, and I was super young when I started, but I pushed all those boundaries. I made a lot of tough decisions, including interviewing and filming the Taliban themselves, ministers, deputy ministers, MPs, governors, men, women, girls, boys, everyone. Yeah, I don't think I would have done anything differently. That's the reason I kept pushing. I was filming even 1 day, 2 days before I left.
Thank you. And John, about the nuance as well in reporting, because I think I was trying to push you on that when we were doing our discussion as well, because hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it, to understand what went wrong, where it went wrong. But at the time, was the reporting, particularly, I think you were alluding as well to the number of deaths and the violence, was that strong enough?
I can't speak for the other media. I can only speak for my own reporting. I mean, I think in general, I'm pretty critical of, I hate the term mainstream media because it suggests that non-mainstream media is virtuous in some unique way, which it's not. I generally am critical of television news of the kind, I think that we legacy, again, I don't like these terms, but you know what I mean. The nightly news broadcasts where they come in and they frame it in a certain way. There's a problem with framing. And I think a lot of the reporting, especially televisual reporting in both Afghanistan and Iraq, in the time of the military expeditions in those countries, tended to be, from the West, tended to be embedded. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do good reporting as an embed, but it does mean that you're with your country's own troops in a foreign country where the locals speak a different language, are from a different culture, and appear to be hostile to you because you're going around with armed troops from your country. So I mostly did not do embedded reporting. So I knew Iraq before the invasion. I knew Afghanistan well before the invasion. And until the very end, I tried to report, admittedly, I'm a foreigner, I'm an outsider, I'm a Westerner, but amongst the Afghans. And it was very awkward and difficult. I found it very, it bothered me greatly when the security situation became such that I had to be with foreign soldiers in order not to be kidnapped or killed or whatever. But I pushed the envelope as far as I could. So I have no, and by the way, so when I began to feel that the American enterprise was failing, I said so. One of my stories from 2010, in other words, 11 years before the Americans retreated from Afghanistan, was called Force and Futility. And the subject line was, is it time to leave Afghanistan? Because that's what I concluded, that it had failed by then. So that was 11 years before. To me, it was obvious that it was a failed mission at that point. The Afghans and the Americans and their Western allies didn't trust one another at that point. There were numerous killings by Afghan soldiers, Taliban who had infiltrated the NATO troops, opportunistic killings of their Western counterparts, numerous. And you could cut the air with a knife between them. So it wasn't just the Taliban, unseen enemy out there in the hills. It was the troops they supposedly had trained to fight the Taliban for them, with which there was also now mistrust. And they felt ever more detached from the population. It was a little different when you went to the capital city. And there was a whole generation, I just want to speak to that too, Tamam's generation, that were, sort of liberated, freed up, connected with the world by that 20-year experience of the outside world arriving, bringing all of these opportunities in some cases, channels to the outside world for a whole new generation of Afghans. The population of Afghanistan more than doubled in those 20 years. It's another thing to know. The average age of an Afghan today is 18 and a half, I think. So, this was a real epic in so many ways. And I feel badly on behalf of that generation of Afghan women and men, women and boys and girls, who believed they were part of the world and now no longer have that ability to participate and have to do so underground. But yeah, I also feel confident that this situation won't last forever. These are resilient people and they're resourceful and they'll find a way forward. But I do feel immensely critical of the West and the US governments for, once again, as in Vietnam, not truly engaging with the country where they have committed the greatest and most grievous sort of policy engagement you can in a foreign country, which is to make war in it and to fail. Because to win would be to raise everyone up and end the violence and end repression, and they didn't do that. And so that's where I'm critical. critical.
Two more questions. A lady there and a gentleman here. And then did you have your hand up as well? And at the back. Sorry. I said I would come to you. Okay, so Asha, lady there, gentleman here, and then afterwards, gentleman here and gentleman at the back. Sorry. And we're running out of time, so we need to be quick. Thank you.
I've got, I think, 3 questions. One of them is, did your reporting take you into covering how the opium trade enriched the warlords? And I wanted to know if that was the case, if the situation today is different because the Taliban were trying to implement banning. Another question is, did you cover anything to do with the mishandling of the financial aid the Americans poured into Afghanistan? And I don't know if I'm talking about the right film, Where the Shine Lights. I understand it's about skiing in Afghanistan. And I wanted to ask you, what was your motivation to choose that theme out of all the problems in Afghanistan? I think it was a very interesting film, but what motivated you to talk about representing Afghan skiers internationally?
Thank you. And the gentleman here? One question, please.
Yeah, the analogy with Vietnam is irresistible because it raises this 500-pound gorilla in the room, which is called, political Islamism. The rule seems to be, when we talk about Western imperialism, it's a question for John, but inspired by what you said, Tamana, about when you said resistance. You weren't talking about resistance to the Americans, but to the indigenous guerrillas, if you like. Rule being, colonial powers tend not to prevail in the end against guerrilla movements. But from the 60s, 70s onwards, in the first half of your career, John, that was a resistance, indirectly or directly inspired by a variation on Marxism, right? Africa, South America, etc., Latin America. We're talking about the Taliban as though they were part of that. They're not, as you've just demonstrated by talking about who you were resisting. It doesn't quite work, does it? Because now we're dealing with a sort of fascistic interpretation of Islam. Let's just not be clever about it or polite. It's not the same thing. And I was just going to ask really to John, but inspired by you, Tamana, what's different and what's the same?
You mean from the Mujahideen to the Taliban?
From Vietnam, from Angola, Mozambique,
okay.
From the Guevaris movements that we talk about when we refer to Vietnam and other places, and what's happening now in Afghanistan, that ISIS are trying to do. Gaza's a hugely complicated one, but Hamas is what it is. Let's just not be polite about it. What's different and what's the same?
Okay. I don't think we have enough time for all of this.
Questions.
Yeah, there's a lot. So I think if you have reported on it, please say, and maybe the lady can look it up. Opium and...
Yes, I have. I went on an opium eradication mission it was one of my first embed things. It was a complete disaster. We were ambushed about 9 times in one day. And it's true that the Taliban, number 1, had almost eradicated opium. Some of the warlords that the Americans sort of allied with when they came in were actually also drug lords. By about 2007, they decided that they needed to try to eradicate it. They did not. It continued to surge. Afghanistan became, it jostles with Burma for being the kind of world's main purveyor of heroin. The Taliban now, we hear, are trying to eradicate it once again. But if anything, there was a resurgence during the American expedition.
Because as the Manna said, they were just chucking, and you said they were chucking money at the wrong people.
It's something that you see around the world. You have the CIA with national security objectives, and you have the DEA with its drug enforcement. And very often they work at odds with each other, which is, if you really get into the weeds, you find stories where CIA has told, the narcotics people to back off, and they will support someone even though knowing that they're corrupt because they're on the right side right side in terms of geostrategic positioning. And that's kind of what happened in Afghanistan. And
That is a
has-
vital point to
Yes,
make.
it is. But-
Tamana, your film.
The film.
So when you're an Afghan and you hear all these negative news about your homeland, it's devastating, it's heartbreaking, it's frustrating, and then you find something hopeful. That was my interest to work on that one, because Afghanistan is not only about war and conflict and Taliban. We are more than that. We have culture, we have faith, we have dignity, we are humans. Like the rest of you. Yeah, that was the reason.
Thank you. Do you want to briefly, because
Yeah.
we've got 2 more questions to
Sure,
go.
the
short
guerrilla
time.
thing. Look, I think
I know it's not a brief question
No,
or a
but I
brief
mean,
answer.
it's an interesting one, and one could have a whole discussion about it. There's such a thing as guerrilla strategy. So in the sense that they are successful guerrillas, as in using guerrilla warfare to a success, the Taliban are up there. They have been very successful as a guerrilla force. They knew when to melt away. They knew when to come back. They knew how to attack their enemy. They knew how to wield terror in order to gain power, clout, fill vacuums. They learned the weaknesses of their enemy, even though their enemy had overwhelming force and economic power, and ultimately they returned to power. That is not a statement of support for the Taliban. It is merely a factual statement of how they operated as guerrillas. They are excellent guerrillas. Now, they could be as fascistic as you want. You could say that, the Shining Path, the Maoist Shining Path guerrillas of Peru were also pretty good guerrillas. They came pretty close to seizing the capital of Lima until their leader was caught. And because it was built around a cult of power, that caused the movement to implode, as Öcalan and the PKK, one could go on. We're in a different, when you're talking about radical Islam, you're talking about a phenomenology that has unique sway and constituency in the Muslim world. And that's something we've seen gain huge power and influence in the post-Cold War years. With the kind of collapse of Marxism, we saw a waning of influence by the radical left in most of the world. And we saw a rise instead of radical Islam as a new insurgent force, particularly in that part of the world. And it's not ended. And it has its terroristic, arms like ISIS as well. But in a sense, all guerrilla forces, there's a template you have to work from. And ultimately, you have to be able to use a combination of genuine appeal, so that you have a real constituency, and terror and effective violence in order to vanquish your enemy and prevail. It's simple. It's not simple, but it's a bit like, it's how do you connect a pond to a river? You dig a canal. If you're a guerrilla, you have to figure out how to gain control over a human pool. And there's a series of ways you do that. You can do it. There's a great saying a Nicaraguan guerrilla once told me, a las buenas o a las malas. You can do it in the good way, or you can do it in the bad way. The good way is winning people over. The bad way is terrorizing them. Both work.
I just want to add that with the radical Islam or political Islam, as you said, that there's, they're a very violent, vocal minority, but there is also a quieter majority there as well. As you said, the Afghan people are not the Taliban. ISIS does not represent every Muslim, obviously. The gentleman at the back, and then who was the? It was you, yeah? Thank you. And then there's one more hand up, so let's just get 3 at a time. But please only ask that lady with the hand up. only one question, please, and then we are out of time. I'm being waved at.
Matthew Luxma, I cover Russia, the war in Ukraine for the Wall Street Journal. My question is kind of about the future of this work. We just saw the Washington Post fired around half of its journalists. We don't know the exact number, but possibly hundreds of foreign correspondents. And I mean, in particular, to a question to you, John, I mean, you've been doing this kind of work for a long time. And both of you, I mean, how many institutionally backed foreign correspondents do you think will have, in 20 years' time, for instance, how will the work change and how difficult will it become to do kind of deep reporting with the institutional backing, going forward?
And then can you just pass your mic to the lady in front of you, please?
Hello, I'm Alexandra from the UK. You both spoke about learning from our mistakes, and my question is, given other conflicts in the region and outside, so Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Vietnam, in terms of future invasions, is it conceivable that invading countries can be successful for the West, or is it naive and perhaps maybe we can't achieve success in countries outside of our own?
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, how do you both view, where we're at with Afghanistan now, now in terms of country, its people, the Taliban are in power, other countries going to have to deal with the Taliban. I mean, what happens to all of the people that are left behind in the medium term that perhaps don't want to live under that regime? Has the West lost interest with those people? Equally, you look at devastating foreign aid cuts, the brink of famine in some parts of the country. It's heartbreaking. Do we have a moral responsibility to be doing more?
I'm glad you asked that, because one of my questions that I didn't get to was about the withholding of funds and splitting them between 9/11 victims. Let's go through as the question. This is a nice question to end on, actually, about the future of for Afghans. So, gentleman's question, then the ladies. John, that was addressed to you about the Washington Post and
The Washington Post.
Oh, that one, yeah.
and the future of
the future
foreign
of the
journalism, international journalism.
Okay. Yeah. It's not a good moment. I don't know that we can extrapolate too much from the current moment. It's such a surreal, grotesque, cartoonish moment with Trump in the White House and a little weasel like Jeff Bezos is the third richest man on earth who seems to care more about his Botox wife and fuck off yacht than, than preserving one of the last great media institutions in the United States. I read somewhere that if he invested 1% of his wealth, he could save the Washington Post forever without firing anybody. So, I mean, it's
And
pathetic.
probably a lot of hunger around the world as well.
Well, indeed, yeah, forget that. But, so, yeah, I'm sorry for the Washington Post and for the colleagues who are losing their jobs. But we've been in the midst of a kind of media vortex amidst, the loss of the economic model going back to the recession in 2008 that kept most of the media alive, the parallel with the revolution in technology that's changing everything. It's brought us to where we are today, and it's also given us some of these new plutocrats like Bezos and Musk and others who are trying to control, and what's his name, the Zuckerberg, that other weasel. They now control a lot of what they like to call the public plaza, right? And they're putting those of us who once upon a time believed in and fought for authentic journalism out of business in order to control. I mean, Musk has X, Trump has Truth Social. He now issues decrees on his own social media channel. Who would have imagined that we'd be here 10, 12 years ago? But we're here. So it's impossible, I think, to imagine where we will be in 5, 10, even 20 years' time. It's going to continue to be an uphill battle. We're going to have to fight our corner and hope that we remain, those of us who are trying to actually report what seems to be the truth, sincerely, we're going to have to continue to try to find ways to do that and to have a constituency that will follow us and believe in us. Otherwise, we're lost. We go the way of, T-Rex. So I tend to be optimistic about that. Just like I feel about the Afghan people, I feel the same about stubborn, tenacious journalists.
I guess also should probably be another conversation, Pramvera, that you can organise about the future of the media. Is it a moment, or if J.D. Vance is next, how long will this go on for? The lady's question about, have we really learnt our lessons? Are there going to be more invasions? I mean, we touched on that a little bit with Venezuela and
I would
Cuba.
also love to add something else. I know it's a difficult time for filmmakers and journalists and media in general, but I believe that things are changing so fast, and we need to prepare and equip ourselves. There is so much care, love, talent, and skills in what we do. We really need to find other ways. If it's not, one medium, what else can we do? Yeah. And this is the time I see a challenge, I also see opportunity. And that's the direction we need to go.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Back to invasion. I strongly believe that invasion must not happen anywhere in the world, because that's not how things work. There needs to be meaningful engagement with different powers, different groups, even if they are not similar. They don't follow the same values as we do. I believe in communication, in meaningful engagement, and that's what we need to do, because we did so many things wrong, and we need to, again, learn from those things. We can't just go and grab a piece of land and hope to, lead those people. That's not going to happen anymore. It should end. We see that it's happening, but 20 years from now, 15 years from now, someone else will sit here like me and talk about the same things. Do we want that? And also, we do have so much power. We think we don't, but we do. Who do you vote for when there is an election? Who do you subscribe? What do you subscribe? What do you read? What do you see? Yeah, these are the things we need to reflect on.
I totally agree. As a sentiment, I feel a little more pessimistic, because I think we're moving into a period, I'm not the first to say this, a period of imperial divvying up of the world again, territorial expansion. Trump mentioned territorial expansion in his inaugural speech, and that is what he's doing as we speak. That's what Putin is doing. We know that Xi would like to do it as well. We're going into a very dangerous period that's in many ways a throwback to previous centuries. And I think, it's perhaps the most dangerous period with an arms race, once again, beginning, the possibility of nuclear war, which I think we all kind of ignored for about 20 years, and now it's back. I think we're in a really dangerous period. But I agree with you that what we need is an alert and cognizant and sensitized, especially young people around the world, in places where they can vote. And I say that with that emphasis because there's a lot of places where people can't vote. And so where they can't vote, I hope they can be resourceful and good guerrillas so that they acquire the necessary power in order to put the barbarians back in the caves where they belong. But I do feel that we're looking at, more bloodshed going forward, I'm sorry to say. As for, just to finally end, Ed, you asked a question about humanitarian aid. Absolutely. Amongst the other things that Trump has thrown into the refuse is this idea that a rich and resourceful nation has some kind of moral responsibility to the less fortunate, or it goes in the same with society itself, right? Civilized nation looks after its least fortunate. And a nation as rich as the United States, it misused a lot of its foreign aid, but not all of it was misused. And the idea that it withdrew it entirely, the way it was done when Trump, and with Musk's help, the richest man on earth, took away the instruments of assistance to the most needy people on earth. That's what actually happened last year. I was in the Congo in October, and no more rape kits in a place where rape is endemic, where, I don't know, 4, 6 out of women get raped. So no more rape kits, thanks to the end of USAID. USAID provided the bulk of the aid, in which all of the other NGOs, British, German, Dutch, Norwegian, also formed kind of like clusters to aid certain areas or certain types of people. And because the USAID money was withdrawn, it all fell apart. So now you're seeing a lot of pretty neglected and bruised corners of the world devolving into wastelands again, with new violence to come because of that. And it's terribly unfortunate. We're going to all pay the price for it in a lot of ways going forward. So all I can hope for is, an election in which humanity is restored in the places of power.
I was just looking for a quote from your book, which I obviously can't find, about the money and the central bank in Afghanistan and the people that you had spoken to. But I have found a couple of other quotes, and then I'm going to pass on to Tamana, actually, John. This was a quote about... you spoke to Zalmay Khalilzad, and at the time it was about the Biden administration's quandary about dealing with the Taliban, and he said it's a problem for the Biden people politically. How do you talk about a grand bargain with the Taliban if the American people think they're a terrorist group, especially when the Talibs have not done enough to dispel that perception, but you need the engagement in order to move forwards, was the point. And then the plan about the Biden administration, the decision made by the Biden administration to split the Afghan reserve money, 50% to go to 9/11 victims' families, and then 50% just being held, not given to the Taliban government to run the economy, and they are struggling because of that. And it says, the quote is, "The Americans need to engage with the current Afghan government through official channels to recognize the Afghan government and cooperate with it. The Taliban is almost unable to govern with a teetering central bank and no diplomatic recognition from the West." Tamana, with that, over to you about the future and where Afghanistan stands now.
It's not an easy one. It's not an easy one. Should I also touch base that, or just...
Sorry? No, that was just a couple of quotes I wanted to offer
just want to make
from
sure
the book.
that I don't have to.
No, thank you.
Future, I think it's very complicated, but also I see light at the end of the tunnel. And for someone like me, if I can see it, I think so many other people are able to see it, because the Russians came, Mujahideen, Taliban, the US, Taliban again, things will change, and that gives me a lot of hope. I might not be the same age, I might be a little bit older, but I always remind myself, like, I learned one thing from Taliban. They resisted for so long, they didn't lose hope, they came back. And I don't want to lose hope.
Tamana, Ayazi, John Lee Anderson, thank you. Thanks everyone for your questions. I think now if there's books to buy, John Lee's books at the back, and you're going to do some signing. Thank you.
And there's lots of humor in the book, by the way. It's not a sad story at all. It's really funny.